Before we get into any real code, I really want to prepare your minds for what we're going to be learning, why we're going to be learning this stuff, and really I think it also going to help you get an understanding of the engineering decisions that Go made. I always say that if you don't really agree with the engineering decisions of a language, you don't agree with those idioms, probably shouldn't be coding in that language because you're just going to be frustrated. And so I like talking about this stuff. So bear with me here, watch this stuff. I think it's going to give you a lot of good insight into what we're doing and why we're doing it and what this language is all about. So we're going to now start to prepare your mind. And one of the things that I love thinking about are these things, these 4 bullet points right here, because somewhere along the line, we became impressed with programs that have really large amounts of code, right? I mean, if you think about the Linux project, the Linux kernel, right now the Linux kernel's got well over 25 million lines of code in it. I don't want to be working on a project that's large. It's too difficult to wrap your head around, especially for one developer. We're going to talk about lines of code. I think lines of code are important in certain areas of the software development process, and we're going to talk about that. And one of the things Go is trying to do is reduce the amount of code that we need in any given project, just to make it easier to manage, make it easier to maintain. And so we're going to be learning how is Go allowing us to minimize the amount of code we need for any given project that we're working on. Now, another thing Go is trying to fix is this idea of creating these large abstractions in your code base. I get it. We need abstraction. We need decoupling. And I promise you we're going to be talking about that. But we want to focus here on thin layers of decoupling. We want to focus on thin layers of abstraction that are precise. And this is where Go is going to be a little different than some of those other languages that you've been working on. And that's going to help us, again, around our readability, our maintainability. So we're going to be talking about that stuff as well. Now, this is a big one that's close to my heart. And what we really forgot, because of the way a lot of programming languages are designed, is that the hardware is the platform. That if performance matters, and it's the hardware that matters, it's the hardware that executes instructions. And one of the nice things about this language is that Go's model is the hardware. It's not a virtual machine that's sitting between us and the hardware. That Go's model is the hardware. And that's going to really lend itself in our ability to be able to read code and write code like you never have before. So we're going to be talking about mechanical sympathy in this class with the idea that the hardware really is the platform. And last, maybe the biggest thing we talk about throughout the entire series here is that we forgot that every decision that we make comes with a cost. For me, engineering is about understanding the cost you're taking for the decisions that you're making. And if you're not really understanding the cost of your decisions, you're not programming, you're hacking. We like to use that word in the industry. And for me, it's a word that says that we don't really know what we're doing. We're just trying to get something done, and that's okay. I mean, there's a lot of times where we've got to prototype and hack things out. The problem isn't hacking in and of itself. The problem is that when we stop from our hack and we don't go back through now and start thinking about the engineering costs of the decisions that we made. So I'm going to be a big proponent of prototyping things first, hacking potentially first, but that's not where it ends. It's just the very beginning of our journey in building production level software. There's 2 other things here as we watch this video that I want us to be prepared for. One of those is that I really want you to start to dive in internally about who you are as a software developer. What are your design philosophies? Do you agree with what Go is saying? Or do you agree with what Go is doing? And there are these 2 ideas around opening your mind here. And the idea is that technology changes quickly, but people's minds change slowly. I want you to think about that, right? Like, our minds change slowly. And I have the job over the next, I don't know what this is going to be, 10, 15, 20 hours, to try to change your mind and move it towards this kind of union around the way Go thinks, the engineering around Go. Because it's easy to adopt new technology, but it's hard to adopt new ways of thinking. And in some cases, the costs that you're taking today in other languages don't cost us so much in Go, But it's also the reverse. The things that don't cost you in other languages cost you pretty heavy here. And that's where this whole idea of a new way of thinking. So in some cases, I've got to kind of break you down and build you back up. And I'm going to try to do that as long as you follow with me. I really want you to take this journey from beginning to end with me so I could really walk you through the mechanics and the semantics and help you change your mind, hopefully, on some of the design philosophies that you have today. The whole point here of this, of my class, really, the whole point of my class is this idea that we ask people to learn how to write before we teach them how to read. I mean, think about that for a second. Like, where else in any other industry do we ask people to sit down and start writing before they read? Even if you took a class, an English class at the university level, you know, that class, that writing class that you take at university is going to have you doing a lot of reading. Because it's reading that teaches us style. It's reading that teaches us what we like and we don't like. And reading then allows you to be better writers. And so we're going to have exercises in this class, and I'm going to point them out to you as we go through the video. And I'm not telling you not to do these exercises, but at the same time, but I really want to focus on the time that we have together is to teach you how to read code. I mean, I want you to look at some of these quotes that I have here under reading code. You know, Alan Kay, if most computer people lack understanding and knowledge, then what they will select will be lacking. Think about that. What they and I want almost every developer, in fact, not almost, I want every developer to have that quote in front of them day in and day out. Because you're making engineering decisions, and it's easy to fall back into the decisions that you're comfortable with. But then you're losing sight about the progress that we have. Maybe there's better techniques, and maybe there's better tech. Maybe there's something better out there. We don't take the time to look at it. This is what Alan Kay is saying. So this class is also about helping you understand that there are really maybe better ways to be writing that code in Go. Ideas around readability and simplicity. And I want you to really kind of take in what Alan is saying there. And I already showed you what Tom Love said about that we're teaching people how to write before we teach them how to read. But maybe Gerald here has one of the best quotes around this. Programming is, among other things, a kind of writing. And one way to learn how to write, right? One way to learn writing is to write, but in other forms, it's also about reading. I mean, look at what Gerard is saying there, right? And when we read examples of good and bad, that facilitates learning. And so that's what we're going to be doing. I'm going to be showing you code. We're going to be reading a lot of code. We're going to be learning how to find those smells in the code, and not just find them, but be able to articulate what it is that we don't like about that. All right. So a lot of what we're talking about in that smells and design philosophies and things like that will transfer into this idea of a mental model. But we're really at a point today. We're at a point today in the industry where legacy code is really going to be a serious problem. Go knows this. The engineers around Go know this. And there's some great quotes here. You know, Peter, I love this quote. There are two kinds of software projects, those that fail and those that turn into legacy horrors. And what is he talking about? He's talking about projects fail when they don't get into production, right? We are being paid to put code in production. That's where we're solving our problems. Whatever our production environment is, that's what we're getting paid to do. So if a project doesn't get into production, it's failed. But if a project does get into production and we're not able to maintain it anymore, well, that's the legacy horror that we're talking about. And if you think about it right now, we've got systems today running on AS400s, mainframes, that are all written in COBOL. And if you think about that even more, the developers who are maintaining these systems today, they're about 65 years or older. They're all retiring. We have a real legacy crisis right now that's about to hit our industry pretty hard. And I love finding that 25-year-old in the room, because I'm always like, hey, if you want to really get rich over the next 10 years, don't learn Go, learn COBOL, right? Because that's where the money's going to be. We're going to need these COBOL developers. But this is a serious thing. I don't want us as an industry writing code anymore that can't be maintained, right? Because even Chuck Moore just said that legacy software is an unappreciated problem. It's a serious problem, right? But it's unappreciated. And it's going to be the downfall of our civilization. I don't want Hollywood anymore making movies about asteroids and earthquakes. We need a movie where every legacy system out there, written in COBOL, has now failed, and nobody knows how to deal with it because there isn't a single unit test. Like that's where we're at, okay? And I don't want to be building software anymore that puts us in that same situation that we're in today. But again, Gerald here, I think, has an interesting quote. And when you think about what he's saying here, right, few programmers would ever contradict that the programs they're writing are going to be maintained by somebody else. I mean, that's what he's saying, right? Think about it, right? If I asked you right now, do you think that the software you're writing today that's in production is going to be maintained by you for the rest of your life? You're going to be like, no, right? Somebody else is going to maintain this. Yet, if you think about it, we don't really architect and design software with that in mind. We don't architect software with the idea that somebody else has got to come in and take this over. And I think one of the things that I've been able to do for the last 30 years is understand that fairly early on and design and architect software that can be maintained. And I want to talk about these things throughout the class as well. I've got some production level software today that's 20 years old, still in production being maintained. Some that's a decade, again, still being maintained. And every once in a while when I meet a developer on those projects, they thank me. They're like, Bill, thank you for building something that's been able to be maintained over this long haul. And it's because I knew early on that this wasn't a project that I wanted to kind of live and then die on. I wanted to be able to move on. And we want to talk about how we also do that throughout this class. But I think Sarah May says something really interesting here. And she says, we think awful code is written by awful devs, but in reality, it's written by reasonable devs under awful circumstances. And I think it's incredibly important to understand this because I'm sure all of us have looked at a code base or a function of some piece of code and was just like, what drugs was the developer on when they wrote this, right? And why are they not sharing them with us? Because it must have been good stuff, right? I know, we're laughing a little bit about that. But what we have to understand a lot of times as well is you might look at a piece of code that doesn't look right anymore. It smells bad. But you don't understand the constraints that the developer was on. You don't understand sometimes even the systems that software was written on that have now been ported to other systems that don't have those same constraints. So we all have to be very tolerant about that legacy code we're looking at and not judge people, but take for face value that this engineer had to make this decision for some reason, and we're going to either improve that code or at least be able to maintain it and keep that consistency. But we're all really moving towards, what I'm really trying to move towards is the idea of a mental model. And I'm going to be big, and you're going to hear me talk about mental models quite a bit in this class. Because if you can't maintain a mental model of your code base, you're not going to be able to debug it, you're not going to be able to grow it, you're not going to be able to have a team around it. Mental models are so important. And Tom Love, who loves numbers, he works on very big projects with the Department of Defense. He said this one time. He said, let's imagine a project is going to end up with 1 million lines of code or more. Right? He says that in the United States, the probability of that project being successful is about 50%. I mean, think about it. He's saying once a project gets to 1 million lines of code or more, the chance of this project not faltering, not being able to be maintained anymore, kind of failing, right, turning into legacy, is about 50%. And why is Tom saying this? Well, let's go back to lines of code for a little bit. I know a lot of developers who don't want to look at that line of code number, but I think there's some important aspects of it. And one of the things that Tom kind of discovered is that if you look at a ream of copy paper, so you've all held a ream of copy paper before. Now, Tom says that's 10,000 lines of code, like 10,000 lines of code in a ream of copy paper. And he said that the average developer cannot maintain really more of a mental model beyond that 10,000 lines of code. And we're not talking about memorizing every line of code in that ream. What he's saying is if you know how that code works, you know the workflow of that code, you know where things are. If I asked you where something was, you'd be able to find it very, very quickly. And he says once you get above 10,000 lines of code, it becomes a very difficult task for any individual developer. And so what we could identify just based on the 10,000 line number is the health of a project and the health of a team. I mean, once your project gets beyond 10,000 lines of code, what we're saying is we really need a second teammate on that code, right? And Go is also trying to help with this, right? I'm not saying that Go is going to try to stretch the 10,000 mental model number, no. What we're saying really is that we can do much more in 10,000 lines of code in Go that we could in other languages. right? So we don't necessarily have to grow our teams as fast, but with other ideas around packaging in this, we could have large projects and large teams and be able to maintain it. So Go is very focused on this idea that if we can reduce the number of lines of code, we can have better success overall with the projects that we're building. If you look at these two quotes from Brian Kernighan, Brian says that the hardest bugs are when our mental model of the situation is just wrong because you can't see the problem at all. And then he says that, everyone knows that debugging is twice as hard as writing code. So if you are as clever as you can be in the first place to write it, how are you ever going to debug it? And he's absolutely right. And one of the things that I think as an industry we've kind of hurt ourselves with is debuggers. We've become developers that rely so much on the debugger. And it's something that I want to get developers off of. It is a tool. It's a great tool maybe to develop a mental model of a code base. But if you're dependent on your debugger to always find problems, you're not making sure your mental models of the code base are clean. You're not making sure that you really understand how things work. Because debuggers don't remove bugs, they just run them in slow motion, right? And we can't have this. Remember, if there's a problem in production, you're going to be going after your logs, your mental models of your code base, and how things work. And so what I want to do is make sure that when you turn that debugger on, it's your last resort, that you've validated that your logs are not helping. You've validated your mental models are not working, and now we got to jump in the debugger. But I promise you that if you need the debugger, we've got some bigger problems. We're not just going to band-aid this thing. We're going to try to figure out where did our mental model of this code base break down? Where did our logs kind of break down to not help us? Because you're not going to detach a debugger in production. You're going to have your logs, you're going to have your mental model of your code base, and that has to be working for you during development. All right, so I want us to begin to start thinking, okay, on how we are going to be better developers. And I want to leverage Go to teach us these ideas, okay, how to maintain these mental models, how to think a little differently than we have before. I'm going to break you down and I'm going to build you back up. And there's other things I want to talk about before we start looking at any code. But this is some of the base things I want you to start to think about and who you are as a developer and how we can all just be better developers and build better code.